Morning, everyone. The December 15th meeting of the Financial Forecasting Work Group, depending on how many people we have, potentially the Budget Coordinating Committee will come to order. 8:33 a.m. The first thing on the agenda was to continue our discussion of the various revenue forecast and expenditure forecast assumptions that Nick and Amy put together. That is available in the folder that Nick continues to update. So if you don't have it in front of you, it might be helpful to pull that out if you're remote. Let's start at the top. The revenue forecast assumptions, property tax levy assumption is 2.5% increase per year. That's what we're legally restricted to, so I don't think there's much discussion there. Any comments?
I don't have a comment on that point, but I just want to flag, I see Rob Milt is listed as an attendee. If he could be promoted to a panelist, that would be great. Sorry, just want to flag that.
Yeah, I did a couple times, so.
Okay, no problem. I just want...
New growth, 1 million a year is the forecast. The one question I had there is whether it says for fiscal 23 to fiscal 26 we've exceeded 1 million. The question there is that conservative enough? Have we looked at a long enough period? Can we be reasonably certain that we're going to continue to exceed $1 million every year?
I think in the near term, we feel more confident in that than we do in the outer years. So when we had plugged it at that amount each year, but we haven't yet revisited in terms of those out years, but we do have a number of large projects underway in construction as we speak. That'll be adding growth in 27 and 28. And then the pipeline for 29 and beyond is less known at this time. Although there's no large projects even that we're aware of at this point that would be like commencing any kind of land use body permitting that would then turn into building permits along that trajectory. So everything that's being built was permitted through land use bodies several years ago at this point.
Great. Okay, so fiscal 27 and fiscal 28, you're confident?
We feel better about that. We asked the assessors to run through it, so we've done that, and we'll report back once they have any adjustment.
Okay.
The 27 new growth is based on what's going on today, so that gives them a better line of sight into where that should land, and nothing has really slowed down as of yet in terms of immediate growth.
Okay. What exclusions?
Sorry, just on the new growth piece. Nick, I know you've shared previously in some like presentations on the kind of bar chart, right, with like new growth year over year. It looks like we've surpassed $1 million in 23, 24, 25, and then if I'm not mistaken, 26 we are expecting. Is that right? But prior to that, we had never surpassed kind of $1 million. We were pretty close in 22, 21.
Yes, that's right. And then in 26, so the certified value of new growth for 26, which is included in the that was just shy of 1.5 million. So if you don't have the final number, it's 1,499,000 something.
Gotcha. So the last 4 years we've been over 1.2, but prior to that
Correct.
we've never broken $1 million. Okay, so $1 million feels conservative based on recent trends, at least, unless obviously construction totally shuts down in the city, in town.
Debt exclusions?
The way the forecasts was written is that the debt exclusions don't assume anything new. It just assumes that what is out there and declining will decline, and then the fire station Hurley Amendment Fund would subsume that. So it doesn't. We didn't add any debt exclusion projects to the spending side of the budget, nor did we add it to the revenue side. So if the Atherton Fire Station requires a debt exclusion over above Hurley Amendment, that would be new cost, but also new revenue. The school project would be new cost plus new revenue. So we didn't roll that into the forecast as of today, just because those costs are unknown for the most part.
Where's the new revenue?
Because it would be debt excluded tax revenue. So if it was $1 million in debt service, we would be able to raise that on the tax levy. So in terms of how it would affect the budget overall from a surplus deficit perspective, it doesn't. It should net out. So we didn't adjust or bring anything in for that.
I don't think this is breaking news, but on the fire station building committee, we're assuming that you may have exhausted the Hurley fund, so that that's not going to be available as a source.
Correct.
Legally obligated medical expenses, doesn't that go away?
No, until that's for a firefighter who was injured in the line of duty, and those expenses are continuing. So that's what that additional.
That's not
fee is.
Thomas?
Nope.
Okay. Local receipts, 1% a year.
Yes. So in order to remain conservative, we've kept the local receipts at 1% a year. I think, and we had a conversation about this at the finance committee level. We're digging a little deeper into it to see where we feel comfortable for 27, where that our revenue has exceeded forecast. There's been a couple of sources that are recurring. There's a couple of sources that are non-recurring. Interest income is the obvious one where we've been so much higher than our history has been, but that's also due to high rates, high amounts of budget money in our funds. So we haven't adjusted that beyond that 1% increase to keep it conservative at this point.
Everyone's benefit, what are the major contributors that are in there?
Motor vehicle excise tax is the biggest. Interest income, the trash fees, which has gone up because we increased the trash fees, building permits. Those are the largest contributors to that.
Restaurant?
I'm sorry?
Restaurant?
The meals tax is about $380,000, I think at this point.
The excise tax has gone up, way up in the last 2 years, right?
Correct.
Pilot payments also go in that one. Can you share? Oh, this might be it. Yeah, I was wondering if you could share how the 1% compares to what we've actually seen, over the last decade, right? Going back to like 2015 or so.
So this figure I just plugged in, 10.35 million would be 1% over 26. And then you can see how that, harder for folks in their own apologies, but in 23, we brought in 10.7 million in local receipts. 24 and 25 have been significantly above that.
Do we know how
Again,
we're running this year? I guess we're only 3 months into it. I'm sorry, so which of those is more predictable? Like, is motor vehicle excise tax something that's predictable?
I have the others.
I mean, I can
on
like look at those numbers and say, well, let's take the average of the latest 5, but I don't know if somebody in town hall has a list of all the motor vehicles and.
We do commitments throughout the year. The largest commitment is done around the new year. So that's when we have a real sense of what the rest of our fiscal year will look like. So the data we have to year to date isn't great. It's after the turn of the new year where we get better data on how we're tracking for the year, if that makes more sense. And I did add Joanna in case she had any additional color commentary to add to that.
It makes some sense, but even, I'm just inferring what the word commitment means, but can't you just take last year's data and say, assume nobody buys or sells their car. If everybody owns the same car as last year, what are we gonna collect, for example? Is that what we're saying?
We could, it's just the depreciation on cars is so quick
Okay.
that it is really
That would
the
be-
new car purchase and turnover. And Joanna, if you wanna fill in or better answer that question, feel free.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea, Jay. We were talking about this at the select board finance committee meeting too. I think that there are some analytics that we can do. The commitment thing means that like anybody who owns a car as of January 1st will get a bill in the first commitment of the calendar year. So those bills will go out in January and they will be due in March. And then every couple months subsequent to that, we kind of catch up with new vehicles that the RMV tells us are registered in town. I think we can do some work off of January's commitment from last year to kind of see the age of the vehicles and like Nick had just said, the depreciation really factors in quickly on these. So it's $25 on every 1,000, but there's a whole like it ratchets down for 5 years. I think that we'll have a better predictor on this come January, mid-January, when we get the file from the RMV of all the cars that are owned in town as of January 1st.
So are you saying if you do what I suggested, which is just take last year's cars, it would be unrealistically low because of all the depreciation?
Well, so if you just took last year's cars, if we just took the amount that we had last year, that would
And
inflate.
depreciated them?
Well, so that's tricky because it's not equal. It's based on the model year. So I mean, I think we could do some work off of it. I'm working on getting the file from the assessor's office of the vehicles owned in town as of January 1st last year. But so to give you an idea, that January 1st last year, we billed out about 18,000 cars. But we just sent out another commitment for, cars towards the, that I think we're on our 6th commitment of calendar year 2025, and our bill numbers are up to like almost 24,000. So there's about 6,000 of new purchases subsequent to January 1st. So it's not perfect, but I really think that the best number and the best gauge that we'll be able to see is something that will come to us in about a month.
Okay, and I'm sorry for getting into the weeds. I shouldn't
It's fine.
focus on telling you how to do your job. I guess what I meant was, can we do something other than look at the last 3 years and average them? And it sounds like you got some ideas.
No, and I think that like car values have gone up too, right? So with this in particular, I just don't think that that's the realistic way to budget this.
Okay,
Thanks, Johanna.
I guess my only thought on it, like 1% seems conservative again, right? And so, I know within our projections we want to be conservative in many ways. I just want to make sure we're being purposeful on where we're being conservative and naming it. And looking at these numbers, the overall local receipts, it looks like have varied between, from 2019 to 2020 increased by 1%, then 4%, then 4%, then 10, then 16, then 10. So like we've been pretty substantially above 1%. Obviously your projections right now for 26 show a pretty remarkable decrease, which, maybe is true. It doesn't seem to be what we've seen since 2019. So I guess I'm still just wondering where exactly the 1% number comes from, why we wouldn't be more comfortable with something like 3 or 4%, given that history. Even just to Jay's point, the kind of motor vehicle excise, which is the largest portion, that seems to be going up 3%, 3%, 2%, 7%, 12%. So, that is also jumping. We had one year where it did dip from 19 to 20.
COVID
But yeah,
year.
I just that would be June 30th, 2020 was after the pandemic had just started. So I don't know if that explains that, but yeah, anyways, just wondering why the 1%, is that too conservative, honestly, or is that what's the thinking?
Yeah, I'd agree. Since COVID, you're 3.6% up is your average.
So I think, I don't necessarily disagree that it's conservative over the top. I think what we're trying to get a better sense of, if, once you extract out things that aren't necessarily recurring, that won't be here in 28, 29 and beyond without any, more certainty, I wouldn't want to bill in operating expenses against those. I mean, just off the top, if you look at penalties and interest, almost 600 grand over the prior year, plus the interest income, which is almost $1 million over where we've been, that's 1.6 million over and above the $10 million estimate. So you start to erode nearly half of what looks like an outlier amount. And then just wanting to have a better grasp of the motor vehicle piece, because again, that contributed almost 900 grand over where the budget was. So those three accounts together account for a lot of the variation. So I would just say that this is where we've kept our initial forecast in. As we get better information, we will revisit for fiscal 27 specifically. And especially, what's coming out this month and actually tomorrow, the state's having their consensus revenue forecast, so we'll have a sense of where they think the overall state economy is headed, what their income will be. And we'll have better data, as we noted, as after we turn the year, in terms of 26 anyway. So I would just view it as an open item for 27 to come back and discuss. I think that a better question for this group might be, what do we want to build in for the long-term forecast?
Yeah.
That doesn't feel too conservative overall.
Yes, that I think that last point was what I was saying, like not informing your FY27 budget specifically, Nick, because obviously there's details within in any individual year, which you have more context to than I do. But just if we look at the long term, how this is worked out, and we're trying to build a long-term forecast, 1% just seemed a little conservative for that projection. But I'm sorry I interrupted you, Brian.
I interrupted you, I think. But yeah, I mean, the more accurate you can get each individual piece, if you can, I know there's a lot of guesses in here that you don't know. The more accurate, you might be able to get like motor vehicle taxes or local meal taxes. If each one of those things is as accurate as possible, the overall picture will be more accurate. And I think, that's what I would try to aim for. Anything you can well predict, you should go to in detail. That's what budget theory.
I think, yeah, Mark, you raise a good issue, which has come up at this meeting previously, and I don't know how to express it very well, but I feel like there's two forecasts we're looking at. There's the forecast for next year's budget, in which we should be conservative, because if we're not, that could be really bad. But then there's like a 5-year forecast, in which case if conservatism builds on conservatism, I'd much rather have a realistic 5-year forecast and a conservative 1-year forecast. I don't know how those two work together exactly, but I think I agree with what you expressed.
Well, that's an important discussion, because there's two things at play here. As you said, we need to be sure that we aren't being so conservative, and this is with regard to the 5-year forecast. We are being so conservative that we are constraining our ability to fund necessary resources. At the same time, the consequences of being wrong are that we end up with a crisis that could have avoided, maybe. And the other factor there is, and I want to get, this is further down the list, but how we think about the operating budget stabilization fund. Right now, the assumption there is we're going to exhaust that fund completely. I'm not sure that's the right approach. So I think, Nick, what would be helpful, particularly with regard to this particular local receipts, is, and you've kind of talked about this, but detail for us, not now, but detail for us how you calculated or the assumptions that you use. This is detail under the detail. the assumptions that you use to calculate or to arrive at the 1% recommendation. And to Jay and Mark's point, whether as we're looking out over a longer period of time, and I think this would only apply to those recurring revenue sources, but would it be prudent to, or as Brian said, look at what the average has been over the last 5, maybe 7 or 8 years, and see whether that gives us something higher than 1%. It probably will. But again, I think at the end of the day, so we might have ideas, we might make some suggestions, but this is your decision, the select board's decision to make, but we'd like to be comfortable with where you are. So the ask is a little more of a deeper dive on how you, for those recurring sources, what assumptions you have about how they will deliver over the next 4 or 5 years, and let's take a look at that and see whether there are areas where we could be perhaps less conservative. Winston, you okay with that?
I see Joanna has her hand up. I think she has a lot more sort of input on this piece, but looking in the discussion on where we change here, in our discussion in the select board finance meeting, we didn't take as much sort of umbrage with this conservative view, in that in most of these categories, we're really going back to where we were in 23. Our biggest outliers being motor vehicle excise, as well as the investment income, which really we're rolling back to about where we saw things in 2023. Not predicting that the receipts we've gotten in 24 and 25 are going to be as close. I understand if folks wanted to say we want to go back and look, Joanna, we talked about the motor vehicle tax, and I think the others are kind of in line, right? What are the ones that are kind of out of whack, like penalties and interests, going back to 650, investment income because of the change in the interest rates back to 450 feels about right to us. But I understand if this group, if there are certain categories you want to drill into, but I think at this point, I am very, very okay with this kind of more conservative outlook. And if we do exceed the receipts again, then I would be willing to call it a trend.
I think I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joanna.
No, that's fine. I was just gonna say, I was gonna sort of suggest the same thing that Winston just remarked, because I feel like my personal opinion is a lot of these bigger numbers here are very market driven. So when you're gonna think about projecting this out for 5 years, it could be a very different interest rate landscape, a very different building landscape. People could be hanging on to the cars that they have and not buying new ones. There's a whole lot of variables here that are tricky to estimate in a longer term forecast. I do think that, and as Winston just mentioned, the we've capitalized on some different rate products that have bumped our interest or investment income up in the last couple of years, and will be again this year, that might not be available to us in future years. And the penalties and interest are largely one-time costs that I see on the collector's side of kind of truing up some old uncollected tax balances. So I caution you on raising this percentage a bit, as aggressive as I'd like to be, so that things are funded as best we can. This doesn't feel like the place that we want to make sure that we're hitting an X percent each year, because there's just so much fluctuation to it.
So I think everyone agrees our guiding principle is we want to be as conservative as we can, particularly on the revenue side. That said, I think a valid point has been raised about whether if we drill down on each source, or let's take the top 5, whether I think we just want to test the assumptions a little bit. So what I'm asking Nick to do is just that. So on motor and it's actually, I think it's Johanna and Nick. On motor vehicle, what are the assumptions there? Why do we think if we're looking out over a longer period, this 1% is still the right path? Same thing for trash. Let's take the top 5 and just drill down on what the assumptions are in each one of those. And we might end up with the same conclusion, but I think a number of people have raised some valid points. So let's give ourselves a little more information and so that we can understand exactly how we got to where we are.
I think the two that in that category that are the biggest to me are the motor vehicle excise tax, and I think it was investment income. Nick, are those both about $1 million different? We spoke about the motor vehicle excise, and what we wanted to look at was the largest numbers from new purchases. So when Joanna gets that list that she mentioned, we'll be able to see where the cars are, because there is a depreciation cycle an amount for each that goes down. So we wanted to see if can we see how many are new and all the questions that were asked before. So I think that's already on the table. For investment income, I think this would fall as well to Joanne about the vehicles and what we can expect in this market environment for the next year or two. So I think those are the two that perhaps are the drivers. I think that those are about 1 to 3 million in there. That would be the big difference between the 1% and more. I think Joanna was already kind of on her way to drilling into those.
Confirmed, Winston.
Okay. Enterprise fund indirect cost.
Yeah, that's just taking all the costs that are borne in the general fund that we share with the enterprise fund, health insurance, employee benefits broadly, and then utilities and stuff. We charge off to stormwater, water, and sewer, so that they share the burden of operating those entities.
Yeah, that seems fine to me.
If it's primarily benefits and benefits are going through the roof, is 5% the correct number?
I think so. We feel okay with that, because other items that are included in that calculation aren't necessarily increasing as quickly.
Okay.
But again, it's something for each individual fiscal year we'll adjust in terms of a forecast that felt appropriate.
Okay. I just, maybe this is too nitpicky, but if we are changing these dials, if we say health insurance isn't 7%, it's 15%, then this will also go up?
Yes, exactly, in a given year where that's the case, correct.
I mean, as we're tweaking our forecasts, not just reality.
Oh, yeah, no, understood.
Chapter 70.
Yeah, this is below where we've been. We just plugged it at $132,000 a year. It's about 1%-ish a year on chapter 70. To our benefit, we've been below that. A couple of years ago, we were significantly above that. We're back to being mostly minimum aid, which is just you get an additional infusion of money each year on a per pupil basis. I think that figure was close to $105 a student last year. But this is where, as there's uncertainty about that state budget, we didn't want to go too beyond just a modest adjustment each year. And that ties out to the unrestricted government aid as well.
That's my question for John and Katie. Are we comfortable that this is going to continue to go up at all?
Yes.
Yes? Wow, shoot, you sound certain about it.
So it's where the state is required to at least do the $30 per pupil more than we got from the previous year. And it's been significantly higher. The per pupil more that we've gotten has been closer to the $100, $150 number in previous years. But I think it's the legal, like whatever is in the actual law is $30 per pupil that we would get.
So that's in spite of or inclusive of whatever they do with the state budget each
It's in spite of.
year. Okay.
Only other thing I'd say is the enrollment number, 4,400. That's a nice round one. That's a little bit higher than we are currently. So again, as we talk about conservatism, maybe we want to just put that enrollment number at the 4,300. Again, it might not matter. It's not a huge difference. Overall enrollment over the last 10 years is averaged at 4,288. If you do it the last 5 years, it's 4,350 or 45, something around that. So anyways, I just think a
That's good. Thanks, Mark.
4,300 number is slightly more conservative.
Yeah, that's a good catch. UGGA, 2% a year.
Yes, this is adjusted by the state, usually in line with where they expect their overall revenue forecast to come in. So we felt the 2% was in line with where things have been over the last several years. It's not a huge amount of money. That's probably $80,000, I think, is the 2% figure of new money. The Mass Municipal Association has been having a very public conversation both in the media and elsewhere about Prop 2.5 and the future of that, and limitations on financial revenue for cities and towns more broadly. And they've really targeted unrestricted general government aid as something to focus on outside of the much more challenging conversations about Prop 2.5. So their legislative push this year, it sounds like, is to have a big jump on that to try to fill back in what had been taken away from the Great Recession. But all that aside, I think 2% feels about okay. Overall, state aid has been just kind of that modest increase year over year. When you take out the assessments, we also get charged.
Okay. Jay, you comfortable with that?
I don't have any comments right now.
Okay. State aid, other categories, no change. That's not too controversial. Overlay reserve.
Again, just trying to be conservative. We have an overlay where we pay a bit, money is put into every year by the assessors when we set the tax rate. And then there's a modest amount that we expect to be released each year. The overlay is funded to cover uncollected property taxes, plus exemptions, abatements, any cases currently tied up at the Appellate Tax Board. So that's what the overlay is generally, and we've been in the ballpark of releasing between $100,000 to $200,000 a year.
Discussed with the assessors or no?
That's because it's been our trend. We haven't visited that with them on a year by year basis. If we feel it's getting too high, we would approach to have a more direct conversation. But in terms of the nature of the forecast, tracking with what our history has been, we felt okay with.
Okay. Free cash we talked about, but I think this is the right assumption, no free cash. Operating budget stabilization fund. So do we think the mandate is full usage? Or should we try to spend a little less?
I'll say, it's hard to say because there wasn't, in my opinion, there wasn't sort of a big conversation about what this was in the override.
Oh, there was.
I think it sort of slipped through. I would say if there is, the prudent use of this is, and this might be too vague, but to maintain level services through the next override. Now, that doesn't mean spend all the money we have to spend in 5 years so we go to an override. If we do better than that, that's great. I think that's the intent, maintain level services, because in previous decades, when I was sort of new to this town, we would pass an override, then the next year we'd be fine. And the year after that, now the library is closed on Sundays. The year after that, now the library is closed on Saturdays and Sundays. The year after that, now we're laying off various people at schools. The year after that, we have an override. So I think the mandate is, don't do that. That's my view.
Nick?
I think I agree with Jay's take on it. When we originally put together this, we anticipated using, the forecast assumed full usage of it over those fiscal years. That's what the baseline was brought in, and our view was, again, the purpose was to draw it down over the course of the next several years prior to feeling the need to raise the override question. So I would agree, more big picture, that was the intention. The more we can avoid using it, the longer we can make things work. I think that is the preference, but the structure of how we set it up is kind of the first situation.
And we projected full usage because
we
had identified a
I
gap.
think the conversation started with, if we do this, when do we anticipate needing another override? So we said, with that assumption, this is how we would have to draw it down based on the operating budget expenses in the 2.5% to 3% range. This is how far we think we can string out if we put $700,000 in it recurring plus a $2 million payment. So it's more like, how far does that get us with the other assumptions? Yeah. That was the framework what we were having the conversation within.
But Jay's thesis that this is to maintain level service across the town departments, that's schools and everyone else. I think is correct. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. Okay. And I just to as a reminder, there's $700,000 of this that is recurring each year. So that's new revenue every year of $700,000 plus 2.5% of the select board votes to increase it each year. And then we had done a standalone appropriation into it of $2 million of free cash. So there is an element of this that is a recurring source of revenue, which is the approximately $700,000.
And unless the select board needs to increase it or not to make a contribution.
It's up to the select board each year to vote to increase it. The max they can increase it on a annual amount is 2.5%.
Yeah.
Alternatively, they can lower the amount or pull it off entirely, and then it goes away forever.
Correct. Okay. Yeah.
This may be getting outside the bounds of this conversation, but just like we did a $2 million free cash contribution last year, I may be getting my ears confused, but we did a $2 million contribution. This year we have $4.5 million free cash. Let's say we spend $1 million on capital. Let's say we spend $1.5 million on other various and sundry things. We might have another $2 million we put in there. And then again, this may be getting beyond the bounds of this conversation. Then, well, if we take $2 million of free cash, put it in there, and then immediately take it out, well, that's not good because that's using free cash on ongoing expenses. If we put $2 million in there and spread the use over the next 5 years, is that okay? I have more questions than answers, but I think this, one good use of free cash might be to put a good chunk of free cash this year into that. Then does that mean we push an override out another year? Does that mean we still have an override in 2030, but the this account isn't drawn down to zero? Again, I have more questions than answers.
Well, my dream with regard to this process and what we're trying to produce here is a financial forecast that looks out about 5 years, that informs the public about where we are and what we're thinking about the town's finances, and each year updates when we think we'll need the next override and why. That's my dream.
That's my dream too.
Okay, good.
I think it's all our dream.
Good. Okay. So I think you're right that we talked earlier in this discussion, the last time we had it, we talked about a principle that says we all agree, I believe, that free cash should not be used for recurring expenses. That said, I agree that we could use free cash to fund or to add to this operating budget stabilization fund, and in that sense, it might in later years be used for recurring expenses to maintain level service.
The other thing I'll just add to this is that as that fund is built up, and it is presently built up, it will incur interest revenue and investment in revenue, which will stay within the fund. So the $700,000 plus the $2 million will earn some amount of money this year that will, so there is, a modest amount. But if, again, there's another contribution from free cash, that'll increase kind of that baseline principle that will be used to potentially earn additional funds that will stay within the fund to be appropriated. So just like all the other stabilization funds, any interest and investment income stays with those funds themselves.
And our esteemed treasurer is responsible for maximizing the returns in those funds.
Correct.
Okay, expenditures. Salaries, this is non-union?
So the way
Salaries.
this is built is, it applies a 2.5% increase to all salary lines across the entire
I
budget.
don't think I'm looking at the same thing you're looking at. Or what are you looking at?
Just the summary sheet. I'll share it, sorry. Give me one moment.
Financial forecast
Yeah.
summary.
Okay, I'm just gonna.
So this is union and non-union.
Correct.
What I was confused by is, so we show a salaries expenditure forecast and then a collective bargaining set aside, which I assume is to fund salaries. So I was a little confused about.
And just to peel that apart a bit, so on the way the broader workbook is set up is we have a set aside for collective bargaining contracts that is increasing by 2.5%. We also have the salary budgets for each individual department. Those are increasing by 2.5% that accounts for like the steps that somebody might receive in a given year. So some departments will have steps for some of their employees. Some of their employees might all be at the top step, so there's a little bit of wiggle room. So across the board, that's how that's set up. The 2.5% is applied again in the forecast, just to the school department salaries line as a whole is applied the 2.5% in terms of how that workbook functions.
That's this top line salaries. Okay. So
The town's collective bargaining set aside is outside of each individual department, so that's why there's one line item for it.
Right.
It's one entire for all the town side bargaining agreements.
and for this salary cost projection, this 2.5% increase includes and encompasses for the school steps and lanes and non-union increases that 2.5% accurately captures that increase per year.
So I think if that's the total number for the school, I think it's probably a little low, just based off of,
I would agree.
because so many of our staff are part of the collective bargaining agreements, and because it's steps and lanes. So typically, I think for this year, in projecting out to fiscal year 27, when we looked at our increase, just the salary portion of the budget increase was about 4%. So, and again, it's very much tied to the collective bargaining agreements, but I do feel that I think just based off of some historical information, and the difference between the steps that are currently built in, the 2.5 may be a little low for the schools.
Yeah, I had the same thought, and so I think we might want to take a look at that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll just
Totally agree.
I was just going to reiterate that the way, again, when we structured this the first time, it was from a revenue side. If this is our revenue, what must our expenses increase at to stay within that? Rather than flipping it around to saying, so the way we built to say is, we have limited revenue, so every budget must stay within a certain range, or else it's unsustainable. And this is the range that everything must stay within to be sustainable. So that's the way we structured it the first time, to give everybody a sense of, we have $4 million in new revenue. That means we can have $4 million in new expenses on an annual basis. And that was the way it was structured the first time around. But I'm not saying that's the right way, it's just how we approached it to
Yeah,
just
so I
explain it.
definitely like to revise that. As we talk about these expenditures, I'd like to accurately reflect what we think those expenses are, and then figure out how we solve it. If there's a gap. That's one of the benefits of a forecast.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this is certainly one I think we need to look at for potential revision.
I mean, this is one you
totally
can
agree.
be accurate on,
Yeah,
at least year to year, you should be really
Absolutely.
accurate.
absolutely.
John has his hand up in case y'all can't see him.
So I agree that expense needs to go up, but I fully understand what Nick is saying. If we were approaching the revenue forecast or approaching the budgeting process through a revenue first lens, and then deciding what exactly we would need to do from the expense side to stay within that. So that's what I think this shows. And then the next step, the 2.0 version of this, is now we have to match expenses to revenue. And then what does that difference look like? And what does that mean to not only FY27, but the 5-year forecast? So, but I'm glad we started here, because I think a revenue side budget projection is really helpful. But I think we're getting ready to go into the next step of now matching expenses that are more realistic to the revenue picture that we're providing.
Yeah, I think this is the difference, as we talked about earlier, between a 1-year budget projection and planning versus a 5-year forecast. Like we need, this is the opposite of what we did on the expense side or the revenue side, where that was very conservative. This is like very hopeful. I don't think there's any evidence that the town or the schools have kind of met a 2.5% increase over the last several years. And so I think we need something that's more reflective. I mean, that is the reason we ultimately need a 2.5 override eventually, is because revenues go up higher than our expenses go up higher than our revenues. And mostly that is salaries, because that's 80% of the overall town budget is salaries. So anyways, agree with all this.
This salary number is not just for schools though, right? It's 2.5.
To apply it across all town
for
departments as well.
all towns.
So if we want to do that as a driver, then perhaps salaries could we have underlying categories for salaries? Because the schools may increase more than others and our net may be 2.5%, right? So if we want to change it and say that we're going to dig into collective bargaining and school salaries versus police, fire, some of the other places over the 5 years, I don't know if everyone wants to get that granular. But just listening to what everyone is saying, like if we're going to do a thing thinking about the schools and the override, maybe some of that needs to be broken out a little differently when we're doing the forecasting.
Yeah, Winston, I think it may not be 4% if you take into account the rest of the town, but remember the school's budget is half the town's budget. So it's going to be, if you're doing the weighted average, schools is going to have a significant impact on what that final figure is. But
no, I agree on that. I just think if we are kind of talking around having a particular eye on the schools because of how big a driver it is. So maybe in the expenditure forecast, what we're missing here is breaking out schools a little differently. And saying because of how large a part of budget it is, or because that's some of our concern, the way the costs are being driven, that we should be looking at where our school expenditures are differently according to our revenue. Because even in the Operation Stabilization Fund, we're talking about some of that was built to sort of backfill schools, right? If anything, they sort of need over the next 3 to 5 years. Correct me if I'm wrong in my view on that.
well, it's the operating budget, so it's all town departments, including the schools. But I don't wanna, I don't wanna single out the schools. All I wanna do is create a weighted average that includes what's actually happening with the school's salary structure.
Is there a way to find out what the salaries increased without the thing that mixes it up is the additional employees that we've hired, but just based on without the new employees, like what the percentage was that it increased by
So
over like the
we
last
have
4 or 5 years?
we have we don't plan on hiring any additional staff for next year. So as you're thinking it from an FY27 perspective, but if you just, I think Katie sent out a level service overview document that shows that just steps and lanes itself is a little over 4%. And then putting money aside for COLA is an added expenditure to that. I would also suggest, and I don't know the answer to this question, but I assume some of the unions do have some small steps and lane structures involved in them on the town side. And my question would be also to Nick, does the 2.5% that you've set aside include a set aside for schools, or is that just a town side set aside for COLA, bargaining, et cetera?
No, that's the town departmental, because we don't put it in our budget anywhere else. We don't put it like, there's not a set aside within the public works budget. It's all centrally budgeted for the town side department. So that's why it's a separate line item. That's just how we show it on the budget. It's a separate article each year as well.
Yeah. And we try to have a set aside as well within the school budget that we, in like this year, in a negotiation year, we would embed that in other parts of the budget in order to not make it as transparent related to negotiation strategy, et cetera. But yeah, I think to everybody's point, it's really helpful to get a real clear, realistic percentage increase for all staffing, because it is 80% of the budget. And then on the school side, because we're so many FTEs, it is an outweighted average, to Leroy's point. And just to be more realistic, because I don't think the schools would ever be able to budget to a 2.5% salary increase without laying people off. That's not level service. That's kind of quasi-level funding versus level service. I know there's a middle ground there, but because we have so many staff in relation to the town,
Right.
they're just not a realistic number. But I understand the exercise and why it's up there, Nick, so I appreciate that. But I think we're just we're beginning to talk about the 2.0 version of that, which is realistic expenses that we might want to be thoughtful about.
Yeah, I might ask that if if the town and the schools can meet just to talk about, again, I think similar to revenue forecasts where you had all those numbers going back, we should be able to have that for salary expenses going back the last 5-10 years of like what have we been doing? I think to Brian's point, like how we figure out how to cut out the FTE growth within that would be important, right? Because there are probably years where that jumped much more because of FTE growth. But I would think we need to base this number off of, again, what have we been doing historically based upon those kind of contractual agreements? And I agree, John, with your point of the collective bargaining set aside. If we have that number here, I think that should be a percentage that's inclusive of both what the schools would need as a set aside, as well as what the town departments would need to set aside. And maybe 2.5% is still the right number to accomplish both of those things. But we should make sure it's reflective of kind of set asides for all collective bargaining across the town.
I'm not sure you want to do that.
Yeah.
Because you've got a bottom line budget, Mark. You don't want to, I don't think you want to set aside a school's designated collective bargaining set aside.
I didn't mean within a particular year that it would be, again, a line item within the budget as much as, again, just how do we, again, maybe it's within the school's projected percent increase in salaries, but just, right, collective bargaining agreements happen every 3 years, right? There needs to be a set aside as the towns are doing. And so where are we collecting that within the 5-year forecast projection to know we need something here? And so again, wherever I think this group, the town wants to put that information, whether it's the salaries category or the collective bargaining set aside category, I just want to make sure that is captured and named, that this thing captures both standard, step and lane changes and as well as collective bargaining set asides for school collective bargaining units.
Yeah, we've added that as a to-do. to develop a revised forecast for that. Time check, does everyone have a hard stop in 3 minutes?
Can't go forever.
Well, let's talk about the next half hour. Does anyone have to leave at 9:30?
I do.
Okay. All right. I think then, being respectful of people's time, we're gonna wrap up for now and pick this up much sooner than we did the last time, because I think these discussions are productive. So pick up where we left off, which is we'll be at pick up with general expenses next time. So thanks, everyone.
Do we want to
Ryan?
pick a day at a time? Or sorry, go ahead.
That's the first thing.
Okay.
Day and time, next day and time. I had 2 questions. Maybe I'll ask them first.
Okay.
I mentioned once about doing a budget summary, like, you know, how we did it for the stabilization funds and this and that, like how you budget. I know we're kind of doing that now, going through the forecast, but I wonder if we should, I'd be happy to offer my time to try to write something up on how we did the stabilization funds, to how we would wanna approach the budget. That's one thing. And the second thing is we talked about, well, that's the first thing. Is there any thoughts on that?
Can you say that again?
You know how we did a write-up for the budget stabilization funds and we did a write-up for free cash and stuff? We do the same type of like policy I mentioned for how we approach the budget, which is kind of what we're doing here to some extent. But like the theories behind it, how you do it. Like where you wanna be conservative, where you wanna be accurate, those type of things. So I do think this affects it. Well, we're going through this now, like we're talking about salaries, you know, like how do you approach that?
I think when we complete this discussion, we will have accomplished that, but let's wait and see. Let's finish
Okay.
this discussion of
All right, that makes sense.
forecasts.
The other thought was, we talked about a software possibly that would help
Yes.
forecasting projections. I just don't want to
Yeah,
forget
I think Winston has already committed the select board to fund new software for Nick and for treasury.
Not for me, for them.
At,
Yes,
at
we're
what
going
level?
through. We're going through the process of having conversations and having demos for a few different solutions.
that. Okay, great.
All right, thanks, everyone. We'll send out, I'll check with Megan and see, because we need a couple of things here. We need a regular meeting and continue this forecast assumptions discussion. So we'll need to schedule both of those, but we'll be back to you very shortly with some proposed dates.
All right,
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
thank you.
Thanks, Nick.